So I'll just introduce myself. Just want to say thanks, Richard. Great for organizing this. I think it's excellent that we're having these kind of discussions and we're opening this forum within which we can kind of explore what right now the technology can do and also where we're moving forward. Um, so myself, I'm a research fellow at University College London. I'm based in the computer science department, but my background is actually in philosophy. So I work in the field of digital ethics. So I work alongside engineers who actually build these systems, and I look at more the legal, discursive, societal impacts, and we kind of see if we can do things where we can make interventions into the actual engineering process, as well as think more broadly about the impact of these technologies and ways to mitigate risk and harm. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about some projects that are happening at UCL. I'm going to talk a little bit about digital ethics, which is the kind of field that which I work in, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the kind of wider discussions and about the kind of economy, etc. So let me begin by talking about. Just let me work out how to change it. Let me begin by talking about some of the things that are taking place at UCL. So most famously, there was in the mechanical engineering department, there was a production of a ventilator, and it was famous on the news. And the image on the screen is from BBC, where they worked with McLaren and other F1 companies to produce fast and cheap ventilators. And I think some of them are already coming on to the ward. So other departments within, this is broadly, I'm just looking at the engineering space, are working on different things. So for example, the civil, environmental and geomatic engineering groups are working on geospatial and geolocation methods for tracking the spread. Also, they can look at monitoring isolation policies and see how that impacts and whether or not that's having the kind of policy outcomes that were intended. We have medical imaging. So I saw that Imtiaz had discussed that. So, by having these kind of automated systems, you can have rapid, quick analysis. You can imagine in a situation like this, how important something like that actually is. We've got security and crime science, which are actually looking, and that's another kind of the use of this technology in behavioral analytics. So we've got issues like social cohesion, which is super interesting in terms of right now we're having this whole forum online, something that, not too long ago would just not have been possible. And at the same time, people are in a state of, in quotes, isolation. So that's something really interesting. So there's kind of psychological aspects to it, but also there are things like, are crime rates going up? Are crime rates going down? How do we monitor this kind of thing? And there's a kind of complex data analytics that goes on in that space. The biochemical engineering department are also working in this vaccine production. And what's really interesting about that is some of the modeling in terms of the vaccine, etc. Some of the modeling came from China, and then it was transferred immediately within a couple of days over to the rest of the world through the web, and people are using some of that data now. I'm working myself on a project, the Chimera project, and it's a way that the part that I'm working on in that project is to work on rapid literature reviews, and we feed those literature reviews. So there's a lot of information coming in at the moment from different sources, people publishing things, and we can't go through the regular review process, which takes 8 months, sometimes a year, sometimes even 2 years. So we have to do rapid literature reviews, and we need to feed that information to people who are working, modelers who are actually working on looking at the data in terms of interventions on the ward in the intensive care units. So for example, some people would need respirators that go internally. Some of them can just be on the face. There was even one question that we looked at, or we're looking at, is where there was a claim that by putting the patient on their stomach, on their chest, that it relieves some of the symptoms. So we're just looking at anything and everything, and it's done in a rapid pace, and it's done in conjunction with modelers. So this is kind of the work that's taking place, and there's a lot more work. But my main concern, and what I'm interested in talking today, to complement the kind of more technical contributions that Tom made and as first part of his talk touched upon, are the kind of digital ethics concerns. And I think this is super important, and I think probably everybody here has got their opinion on this and have their perspective on it. We might think that so some of the tangible concerns are, if you've got say, for example, tracking data, geolocation data, etc. Then you've got concerns of privacy, of mass surveillance, and we know that these are issues of civil liberties. And I think privacy is probably one of those big, probably the kind of paradigmatic digital ethics issue. With respect to behavioral analytics, I've put here psychometric intervention. So if you've got a policy and you want to implement that policy, you can use powerful algorithms and other mechanisms by which to nudge or encourage certain kinds of behavior. And then we have and it might be in quotes for the greater good, for the public good. If you wanted to, for example, disseminate information, or if you wanted to counter disinformation, and so on and so forth. But then there's issues of accountability, issues of consent, etc. So there are these kind of digital ethics issues on that side. And with respect to just the technology itself, we need to be aware that obviously these technologies are not bulletproof, that sometimes these technologies can amplify bias. That's another big area of digital ethics at the moment, where people can see that the imaging may be using data sets and other kind of, there may be other reasons why, let's say, for example, issues of gender or issues of certain demographics might amplify misdiagnosis. And this is another issue because you've also got issues to do with redress, right to redress. How would you address that, and so on and so forth. So on the other side of the slide here, I want to raise the concern, the ethical concern of not using AI. So what if we were not utilizing these technologies? And most people would argue that, of course, we should use what's at our hands. And I think that if we weigh the risks with the kind of rewards, I don't think, and unfortunately, this isn't a kind of popular opinion, but most people are quite comfortable with this data analytics. I think that the normalization of a distribution curve or bell curve in the consciousness of wider society is one of the results of the COVID situation. But generally speaking, digital ethics, sometimes it can be motivated by a moral panic. And this is something which I think we need to really be aware of. So the example that Imtiaz gave of the 5Gs causing a virus, at first it was a kind of running joke amongst a group of us. And what we've really got to think about is, and the reason why it's running joke is because, there has to be, if there's going to be a conspiracy, there has to be some plausibility. And even though Imtiaz was showing that, okay, these are not ionizing types of waves. I mean, even to get to the point where you have to make that argument is something I think we should be very worried about. If that level of kind of skepticism or technophobia is present, then it's something that we need to be aware of as a community of people who, I'm not sure if it's fair to say, but are generally positive towards tech, which is something that I am. I land on the side which is the benefits are just overwhelming, and we should mitigate the risks and we should understand the harms, but we should understand it overwhelmingly as a progressive thing. So there's, generally speaking, we have these kind of three approaches in digital ethics to mitigating the risks and mitigating the harms. The first one is the issue of principles and legislation. So this is something, so I've got these two images here. One is of a UK publication, and one is of an EU publication on the white paper. I'm sure many of you have come across it. And these two publications came out in February, so they're hot. They just came out, a month or 2 months ago. And there is a difference of opinion here, where the British are slightly less, let's say, ready to regulate, and the EU are, well, this is just my personal reading, but as I read the white paper, they seem to be a bit more likely to regulate. So there is this kind of debate. But one of the big pushes in this space, and both publications are pushing for this, is some kind of impact assessment. So an AI impact assessment. And this brings us on to ethical by design. So we can talk about principles, we can talk about legislation, etc. But you can actually build these systems in ways, and you can have these tools in place which audit these systems, that look at these systems. You can put in governance structures. So there are ways more than just legislating or just kind of declaring our fear of something. There are actual technical ways to kind of ensure that we can do this. It's not just, if you will, through legislation. The third thing, and I've put it here, social business, and I said ethical consciousness, is actually something that comes out of business ethics. So if you're determined, if you're motivated, you can get around laws and you can get around kind of technical constraints, etc. Or maybe I'm not qualified to make that particular statement, but it's about the consciousness. It's about how we as a society, or we as engineers, or we as people who are in this field, do we behave, or are we acting in good faith? And that's something I think we need to think about. We need to think about cultural consciousness. We need to think about cultural shifts. So this thing in the previous slide, this discussion of technophobia or moral panic, etc. These might not be, even though I agree with Imtihaz in just showing the kind of, the kind of blatant truth of it from an empirical perspective. But maybe there's something else going on. Has there been an erosion of our deference towards the scientific community, etc.? That's something that probably we need to tackle. So I'll just move on and talk about the final stage. And this is a lot of what Imtihaz was talking about at the end. And it's about, okay, so what is our exit strategy? How are we going to move forward with this? And, we want to talk about a new economy. We want to talk about, possibilities. So one of the points, and I thought it was really cogent, was this issue of labor. And I think that one of the reasons why, and I won't get into a lengthy debate about this, but one of my concerns about a lot of the discussions about the loss of work, and people already proposing things like universal basic income, etc., is that it takes it almost for granted that there's going to be a devastating impact on jobs, that it's inevitable that there's going to be mass unemployment. I don't think that that's the case. I think that it's possible that new jobs are going to emerge, that new industries are going to come about. In the same way as when we went from agrarian to urban society, people will say, oh, if we're not farming, what are we going to do? You have to imagine, this is an imaginative, a futuristic field, something that we need to think about. And I think that if we think about this, I put here proactively rather than reactionary, if we think about what's coming and we kind of take the bull by the horns, then we can actually bring about these things in a particular way. So for example, the issue of when people were talking about Cambridge Analytica, etc., everybody responded to that with issues of should we change the law, etc. Are there ways that we can anticipate some of these and ensure that we develop these things in a particular way? Another thing I want to say is that as an economy and as a society, if we do it right, if we're proactive, then actually we can amplify this globally. So, GDPR has now is something that we've done here in Europe. It's now become the global standard. It's become the go-to legislation. So we know that if we do it properly, then there's ways in which we can kind of spread this globally. But in order to do that, you need to be at the forefront of innovation and the forefront of regulation. Another thing here is that if we're not doing this innovation, if we're not pushing in a particular way, then it's almost inevitable that we're going to find these gargantuan monopolies, tech monopolies. And I think that the kind of startup community, the kind of conscientious innovator, the universities, the academies, etc., these are great centers of learning and innovation. And some of them are more, consciously for the public good. Not to suggest that everybody working in the big tech are not doing that. But this is something that we can actually do. We can structure, and we can do that through different kinds of interventions, such as making sure that our universities are well funded, making sure that the tech communities are allowed to flourish and these ecosystems are allowed to form. So I just want to say that, this is futuristic thinking. This is something which can go one way or the other. It can go a kind of million ways. Taking ownership over these things is crucial. I think that we can do it. I think that we can actually, we can positively move this kind of disastrous situation. We can kind of take this as an opportunity that has unfortunate, obviously, context, and actually think about how we can kind of positively move forward with this in ways that kind of anticipate what are potential harms, and actually just make sure that we get the beneficial side to it. So I think that's pretty much what I'm going to say. And yep, that's me. Please do reach out or anything like that, and I'm happy to take any questions.